If you're a parent or even a teacher and you're looking for educational alternatives, let me ask you this question. What kind of education do you want? Let me share my screen with you. And if you're like most people at first glance, you're thinking, what do you mean? Like, what kind of education? What kinds are there? That's great. Let me talk a little bit about the different kinds of education. I have got a degree in education and was never taught this information, had to go look it up on my own. But going back a bit in history, the first kind of education that we should talk about would be what's called a liberal arts education. You've probably heard of a liberal arts school or something like that. This goes back, it comes out of the Renaissance and the Reformation, and the purpose of a liberal arts education is to perpetuate the knowledge and values of Western civilization and to promote individual human flourishing. And how this is done is through the study of the seven liberal arts and the reading of the great books, and there's an emphasis on individual wisdom and virtue. This is the kind of education that arose in Europe after like 15, 16, 1700s, and also was seen in America from the colonial days. And so this kind of is the first kind of education that I want to talk about. The seven liberal arts are actually subjects: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. And here is a photograph of some of the great books that I delve into in my math and science class. This is Galileo, Ptolemy, Kepler, Newton, Descartes, Euclid, and things of that nature. So that's typically what people should think of when they think of a liberal arts education. It's the kind of education we had in America up through about the late 1800s or so. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a change. Started in Germany, but came to America through John Dewey and folks like that, the progressives. The goal of the progressives was not to perpetuate Western civilization, culture, and ideas, but to actually fit students to the existing culture. And so it was a scientific only kind of curriculum. They stripped out the humanities and poetry and Shakespeare and all that stuff. We're going to focus on just kind of like the nuts and bolts and things. And so it was primarily vocational only training for a job. The vocations at that time were primarily industrial, so the classroom was changed to an industrial kind of a factory setting. There was a de-emphasis on knowledge, and there was an increased emphasis on group projects. Students were classified or categorized by age, not by their ability level. So the peer group became the dominant influence on the student, not parents or teachers. And this is the kind of education that we think of in America primarily up through strong in the 50s and so forth like that. But in the 1900s, this was the educational model. And it went back and forth between progressive and a liberal arts education in various areas. So here's a comparison of a factory and a schoolroom. And gee, the students are all lined up in nice little rows and they're producing little individual things. And yeah, so it's very much kind of a factory mindset. Here's a PowerPoint slide I pulled off the internet where they're directly saying, look, the primary school learners, they go into the upper school. The teachers here then do their job of teaching. The student takes an exam. If they pass, they proceed. But if they fail, they have to resit for the teaching. What's the goal? Further education or training, right? But ultimately, it's the workforce. We're going to train you for a job. That's why you're here in school. And of course, being a mathematics teacher, I love having a student ask me, Mr. Marsh, when am I ever going to use this in my job? It's not really an honest question often, but I will tell them honestly, never. That's not why you learn it, right? Here's a t-shirt that you can buy. Another day has passed and I didn't use algebra in my job, right? See, I'll come back to this in the end. And so that was the kind of education that we usually think of up through maybe the mid 90s even. But in the mid 90s, there was even a further change. Now we get into this level of an activist education. Here, I'll show you the picture too. The purpose of an activist education is not even to fit students to the culture. It's to use the students to change the culture into something that it currently isn't, into something else. And so it's heavily Marxist. The focus is not even on group projects anymore, it's group identity. And all supposed knowledge is reinterpreted to serve the cause. And that's the modern en vogue philosophy now in education through critical race theory or other things like that. This is a picture that was taken actually in Wichita, Kansas. I know the guy that took the photograph. It was taken in 2003. This was the beginning kind of the highest goal of education is tolerance. Wait, that's not perpetuating the ideas and values of Western culture. Nor is it simply training a student for a job. What is it? It's the beginning of the activist thing. And so not even tolerance is kind of like not a thing anymore, right? We need change. And so here's some current pictures. These are students. So if you're thinking about a change in education, let me ask you, what kind of education do you want? A lot of folks think they want to go back to what they had in school, parents and so forth, and that would maybe be this. That would be like, okay, we're going to learn job skills and how to add, subtract, multiply, divide, and stuff like that. But if a student decides he's going to be a future engineer, why should he have to learn Shakespeare? Or why should the person who's going to be a future poet have to learn algebra? I propose to you that the kind of education that really is the best kind of education, not just for the culture but also for the individual, is a liberal arts education. This is commonly now called classical education. What's the goal? To promote the ideas and values of Western civilization, which is tremendously prosperous and truly good, and to promote individual human flourishing. You do that through reading of the great books and an emphasis on wisdom and virtue. I tell my students, look, you go to the gym and you might do like bench press. Why does a person go to the gym and do bench press? They're never going to use that in their job. Well, they say, they want to get strong. And I say, why? Quoting Pascal, paraphrasing Pascal, why does a weak body bother us but a weak mind doesn't? Oh boy. See, the reason that I think students should study algebra, even if they're never going to use it in their job, is because it makes the mind strong and it promotes virtue in the student. It's hard. It takes work. So if you want some resources, these are the two best books that has promoted me on this path. Number one is the Paideia Proposal by Mortimer Adler. It's a thin little book. He wrote it in the 80s. He doesn't ever use the word classical in it or anything like that, but he's promoting a liberal arts sort of an education. It's very, very good. The next one is written by a buddy of Mortimer Adler's. It's the Great Conversation. It's volume 1. It's actually the very first book in the Great Book series. Book number 1 is the introduction by Robert Hutchins. And so The Great Conversation by Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler's Paideia Proposal would perhaps be a good place to start. But investigate classical education, because if you're looking for a change, if you're not satisfied, I think you will be best served by a classical education. And if you want to, send me a message. I'll be glad to respond. Anyway, let's continue to pursue goodness, truth, and beauty.